At long last, the holy man stands naked in the snow before the legendary stone tower that had lost its name to the ages. A tower that is said to grant a wish for whoever reaches the top, but with none to speak of such blessings, for their feet no longer touch the soil after entering. The holy man pondered his existence before entering, as the icy winds felt like the many blades that had cut into his skin with every breeze that passed by. He is equipped with only 3 items: an indestructible iron mask, fixed with only 2 square eye holes, and keeps his soul bound to the earth, a silver claymore that can cut through anything but leaves a scar of the greatest sin of those he has slain that has now covered every inch of his body, and lastly a throned rosary wrapped around the guard of his blade and forearm, binding the weapon to his soul. The holy man stepped towards the door with the flat of his blade resting against his shoulder and the pommel sitting in the palm of his hand. He inhales, bringing a long-forgotten feeling for the first time in years. Before opening the door to see an abyss, he stepped forward through the archway as a man suddenly appeared before him, on his hands and knees in search of something. The man looked up at the naked holy man, covered in scar tissue, with the look of fear and confusion on his face, before crying out, "Where in bloody hell do you all keep coming from? I need to get the fuck out of here." The holy man turned to point at the entrance to see no door, but a never-ending hallway. A hallway full of men and women feeling on the floors and walls, as if there were a hidden doorway beyond their reach. Those unmoving were assumed dead, while others had missing limbs that never stopped bleeding. All looked starved and depraved, nothing but suffering. The holy man let his claymore fall from his shoulder onto the man in front of him and bisect him straight down the middle, before coming to rest at his side, sticking out of the floor. He turned to face the others that were suffering as they continued to claw at the walls and floor. Unfazed by what he had just done, the holy man walked into the center of them and cut them where they stood in one swing. Blood and viscera painted the walls and the floor as his blade stayed true, leaving clean cuts in the walls of the hallway. Those that should have been dead were still suffering. The assumption that their hearts and minds were what kept them bound to this world came to mind. The holy man stood over each one and first plunged his blade into their hearts and then crushed their heads beneath his bare feet. While tears fell from his mask, he knew his task was done when he felt their sins burn into his skin, leaving new scar tissue on top of old, and the rivers of sorrow that fell from his eyes. The holy man stuck his claymore into the ground and rested his head against the pommel in a silent prayer. After the prayer was finished, he used his foot to help swing the blade up and let the flat side rest on his shoulder once again, before heading forth into the labyrinth. The walls were forever changing as new torches, doors, corridors and bodies would appear. Whenever something was no longer in sight, the holy man paid no mind to this, since faith would guide him to the top. The labyrinth took him down a set of stairs and through miles of desolate hallway that shouldn't exist. The holy man turned the corner to see two men squatting over a lifeless body as one scooped handfuls of brain into his mouth. The other had his back turned to the holy man and was chewing on the intestines that were hanging out the belly of the corpse, whose heart was still pumping. The men wore human bones as protection and cloaks made from skin. The man eating the brains noticed the holy man advancing in their direction and immediately jumped to his feet, making the other turn around with intestines hanging from his mouth. The savage man standing, charged the holy man and kneed the other in the face as he excitedly stepped over the lifeless body to get to the fresh meal. The holy man grasped his claymore with both hands, spun his body around to gain momentum, and crushed the savage man's head with the flat side of his blade against the wall. The savage slumped to the ground, leaving his brain matter on the wall and his eyes hanging from their sockets. The holy man plunged his blade into the top of the savage's head and pierced through his heart, adding another scar to his body. Scurrying to his feet, the other savage of a man stepped on the still beating heart while charging the holy man. After regaining his composure, the holy man stepped forward while gripping the hilt of his claymore with both hands and let the corpse slide off the end of his blade while swinging it in an upward motion. The body was flung in the direction of the savage man, making him duck under the body and lining him up for the holy man to drive his claymore in between his eyes. The savage man's momentum brought him to a stop at the guard of the claymore as the holy man used it to bring his blade up to listen to the last beat of a skewered man's heart. Tears fell from under his iron mask as another sin appeared on his body. With a twist of his blade, the body fell from the claymore in front of the holy man and splayed open on the floor. Following faith, the holy man continued his trek through the labyrinth, covered in the blood of all those he had slain. A light at the end of a seemingly endless corridor drew in the holy man like a moth to a flame. The light always guided the way, but the children's laughter, that was usually a good omen, could be very deceitful in such a place. The holy man passed through the archway, shielding his eyes, into a chamber that didn't make sense to exist in such a place. The holy man felt grass between his toes for the first time in decades, as his eyes fell on a garden of a floral abundance he could not understand. He took another step, scanning the chamber to see a small pond with children running around it in a playful manner. while a little girl watched from a swing that hung from a tree. The chamber had 7 headless statues, evenly placed around the room, that stood with their arms at their sides and had a stone blade in front of them. He looked up at the blue sky to see a shadowless head full of luscious curls blocking his view. It was suspended in the air by numerous chains in the centre of the chamber, whose eyes were always watching. "Oh, a visitor," yelled the little girl, waving to the holy man. The holy man made his way to her, gripping the hilt of his claymore with his right hand while it rested on his shoulder. "No threats here," said the little girl, easing the tension. "So please come and get cleaned up. We don't get much company coming through here." The holy man stopped before the pond, and the little girl spoke again. "Go ahead and step in. It won't hurt you." The holy man stepped into the pond and let the blood wash away from his scarred skin and from in between the nooks of his equipment. The pond water stayed as clear as it was before he stepped in, and the children continued to play as if he didn't exist. The little girl swung back and forth without a care in the world. I can see where one would be confused at such a sight, but this was my wish, and I'm glad you respected the rules. See, we had stumbled upon this tower by accident many years ago as we were fleeing from our father's hunting hounds. He did not agree with our relationship. The little girl froze in the middle of her story when she looked into the pond that the holy man sat in. The holy man looked up at the forever gazing head staring back at him, and at her all at the same time. He stepped out of the pond and rested his claymore against his shoulder, then made his way to a wooden door that was across from the entry of the chamber. The holy man stepped through the door into another chamber. There stood a man wearing steel chainmail and a violet cloak obscuring his face on the opposite side of the room. The walls were lined with weapons from the floor to the ceiling of all variations. "Do you have no decency in the face of pride?" yelled the cloaked man. The holy man scanned the room before Pride spoke again while brandishing a rapier from under his coat. "No matter, you being here alone shows that you are a great warrior, so I will pay no mind to your attire. On guard!" In a flash, Pride was in front of the holy man with the attempt of burying the rapier into his chest, but the holy man was quick with his heavy blade. The holy man gripped his claymore and used the guard of his blade to push the point of Pride's sword above his shoulder, then brought it down in front of him with all his might. Pride jumped back just in time to avoid the attack, as the holy man followed up by bashing his shoulder into the cloaked man's chest to throw him off guard. He then tightened his grip with both hands and swung his blade wide. Pride ducked just in time to keep his head, but his weapon wasn't as fortunate. Pride circled the holy man, with his back against the wall and his cloak flicking behind him. Alas, a challenge has entered my chambers. No matter, you will fall as those before you, said Pride, before charging in for another attack. With his hands concealed in his cloak, the holy man held his claymore with his left hand, halfway up the blade, bracing for the attack. Swipe after swipe, the holy man blocked Pride's hook-tipped daggers with his claymore. Every spark of his blade was matched with splashes of blood. As each attack grew faster, Pride closed the distance, enough to dig 4 daggers in the holy man's back and 2 in his abdomen. He ended his flurry by driving what was left of his rapier under the holy man's mask before kicking him away. The holy man stepped back and let his claymore rest at his side. He slowly pulled the rapier from under his chin with his free hand, then dropped it to the floor and left the daggers Pride left sticking out of his body. Your magic will not help you, for you cannot beat one as blessed and skilled as I, screamed Pride, as the holy man held his claymore in front of him at the ready. Pride threw off his cloak, revealing 5 other arms extending from his back, holding weapons, and a head covered with eyes all around, all except for the mouth, placed where the nose would be, and holes in place of his ears in the side of his head. The creature held 2 cutlasses with his normal hands, 4 short swords in the hands going around his sides, and a morning star being held by the longest arms, hand overhead. The holy man charged in with his claymore overhead, making Pride cross his 6 blades to block the attack. His claymore cut through Pride's blades with ease, and Pride moved out of the way of a fatal blow, not quick enough to save 2 of his right arms extending from his back. Pride drove what remained of the short swords in his left hands into the holy man's right shoulder and in between his ribs. He followed up by using what was left of the 2 cutlasses to slice an X into the holy man's chest, and threw the blades to the ground, then finished it off by grabbing the 2 hooked daggers from the holy man's abdomen and ripped them out. The holy man grabbed hold of Pride's right wrist before he could get away and snapped it with ease, making Pride grimace. The extra arm overhead knocked the holy man off his feet when the morning star made contact with his head. The holy man used his claymore to rise to his feet, the hilts of the short swords sticking out from his side let out spurts of blood with his every move. He then reset his broken neck by sticking his fingers in the eyes of the mask and violently jerking his head straight. He looked up at Pride, who was standing across from him with a grin from ear to ear, holding one of the daggers that were lodged into the holy man's abdomen. His intestines hung from the hooked tip of the blade, while the other dagger laid in the ground not far from him. Let's see how you do without your guts, you bloody bastard, said Pride as he started to disembowel the holy man where he stood. The holy man pried open his stomach with his free hand and threw his entrails on the ground to his feet in a bloody heap, making Pride gasp in disgust. "You foul beast!" Pride ripped a lance from the wall with his good hand and ran at the holy man. He drove the lance through the holy man's heart, who was still standing unfazed, with his claymore at his side, out of frustration, screaming, "You cannot best Pride." His morning star beat into the holy man's head, blow after blow, keeping him close so he could not use his weapon. The holy man pulled Pride closer by the collar of his chainmail and bashed his iron mask into Pride's face again and again. The arm beating him with the morning star became weaker after each collision with Pride's skull until it went limp. The holy man dropped Pride's disorientated body to the ground, leaving a mess of his mouth and the majority of the eyes in the front hanging from their sockets. The holy man stuck his claymore into the ground next to Pride's neck and looked down at the fallen. Pride spit a tooth up at the holy man, making it bounce off his mask. "You show sympathy in the face of victory. Pathetic." The holy man cocked his foot back and kicked the side of Pride's head. His silver claymore glided through Pride's neck and sent his head skipping across the ground. He then slowly pulled the lance from his chest and impaled it through Pride's heart. A tear fell from under his iron mask. The holy man looked up as the word Pride illuminated all over his body, then disappeared, but scars still covered every inch of his body. He scanned the chamber for another door other than the one he had entered, while the holes in his chest and stomach glowed with a white light. The holy man rested his claymore against his shoulder and progressed to the door he had come through. The white light turned into his entrails, and whatever was damaged reanimated until he was whole again. Pride's blades pushed out from his back and side down to the floor. He placed his hand against the door and pushed it open to see another void. He stepped through like he did when he entered the tower into a decrepit hallway, with the door disappearing behind him. The holy man followed the path to a spiral staircase that descended into complete darkness. Screams echoed from all around as he made his way down. Footsteps were heard coming from below, but the holy man continued pushing on without a fret. The holy man finally saw the woman making her way up the stairs with a fear-stricken face, and he prepared to end her suffering. She screamed in terror at the sight of him, threw herself off the staircase and back into the pit. The holy man watched her body disappear into the darkness before hearing her body smack against the ground, giving him an idea of how much further he must go. Upon reaching the bottom, the woman was no longer there. The holy man looked around to see where she had gone and noticed a blood trail into a corridor from where she had landed, leaving her brain matter behind. The holy man followed the blood trail to see 3 hounds trying to rip her apart 3 ways. Two had a hold of her hands, while the third pulled at one of her feet. The beasts had long shaggy hair that flickered in the air and dissipated at the tips into smoke. A growl was heard behind the holy man that grew louder the closer it got. The holy man pushed the blade of the claymore from his shoulder and used the momentum to turn around while swinging upward. His claymore passed clean through the hound that was stalking him and turned it into a puff of black smoke. The holy man looked at his claymore, then turned to face the other three that were feasting on the woman from before. The hounds were now baring their grotesque fangs that pierced through their snouts in his direction. A howl came from deep in the labyrinth, and they closed in on their prey. One took the front, while the other two circled around the holy man in the narrow hallway. The one in front lunged at him first. He plunged his blade into its mouth, making it disappear into smoke. The hound that circled to the left grabbed a hold of his arm mid-thrust with its maw and pulled him off balance. It shook its head violently, ripping the skin and muscle in his forearm with ease, as the hound that circled right went for his throat. The holy man lowered himself, then shoved his iron mask into the hound's mouth on the right to keep it from closing. He slammed its head into the wall with his own. The hound's jaw snapped and its skull cracked from the impact before turning into a puff of smoke. The holy man could hear nails scraping against the ground, getting closer and closer, and realised the hound ripping apart his forearm was just buying time. He yanked his forearm in front of him and brought the pummel of his claymore down on the hound's face, making it no more. The holy man picked up his pace in the direction of the hounds, with his claymore resting on his shoulder. His left arm began to glow, then shortly after reanimated, as the path came to a fork, with hounds coming from both directions. The holy man stood fast, with both hands gripping the claymore, holding it in front of him. Hounds came flooding in from both sides, circling the holy man in a sea of black. The holy man swung wide, clearing out the first wave, then was immediately overwhelmed. He fought as best he could, but they ripped him apart, piece by piece. The holy man noticed the hounds were not feasting. The chunks they were taking from him were passing through their stomachs and onto the floor. Those who ripped off a piece of his body would turn and run in the opposite direction. The holy man rested his body, closed his eyes, and let them rip him to pieces. One of the hounds ripped his head from the rest of his body and ran off into the darkness, holding it by the meat of his neck. The holy man opened his eyes to see pieces of himself being carried by shadows through the labyrinth. His right foot, the whole right arm still gripping his claymore, and even his crutch were all travelling next to him, all in the same direction. Reminded him of the first time he had lost his body, the first time he had rested for many, many years, until his body reanimated itself for the first time. The holy war never ends. The hound carrying the holy man's head dissipated into smoke after passing through an archway. His head rolled into a chamber until coming to a stop on its side, while his eyes darted around, looking for their creator. He was in the garden again. Oh, his poor soul was taken by the hounds. The holy man's neck began to glow as a white silhouette took the shape of his body, reanimating itself once again. Starting at the neck, his bones formed first, next his organs, and his muscles grew over them, holding them in place, and lastly his scarred covered skin. The holy man rose to his feet as the rosary pushed his way out of his right forearm, dripping blood onto the grass below. He looked at his right hand to see his claymore forge itself from light before him, forever bound to his soul. The holy man looked back to see piles of human remains scattered round the entrance of the chamber, limbs of many other than his own. A hound was heading in the direction of the chamber in a full sprint with a limb in its maw. The holy man braced himself for the attack, but the little girl spoke. I advise you, do not engage. You will be breaking one of our rules. The holy man lowered his claymore and let the hound enter the chamber as it turned into a puff of black smoke. The limb that it carried tumbled on the grass before coming to a halt in front of the holy man. He bent down to pick it up and examine it to see that it was an arm with a bracelet. The little girl spoke once again. The man in the next chamber likes to acquire things, but does not like company or leaving his domain. He lets his hounds bring him pieces of those seeking the top of the tower and takes whatever items they may possess. The holy man turned to look for the door to the next chamber. That was nowhere in sight. The little girl swinging by the pond came into view, as well as new children playing in the garden. The holy man made his way to the wall across the chamber, with his claymore resting against his shoulder, and placed his free hand against it. I could not tell you how the items make their way into his chamber. Over time, the limbs are absorbed by the garden, and the items simply disappear. Reminds me of when my brother had first entered the tower. The holy man continued to make his way around the perimeter of the wall, looking for a hidden entrance. She continued, he protected me like he promised, as I catered to his every need, and the labyrinth became our home. The chambers are what made us stronger. It helped grow our bond, even though those who had grown from sin itself still didn't understand, except for one. It understood. It felt what we felt, and it listened when no one else did. The little girl stopped mid-sentence after realizing the holy man was no longer there. The holy man walked into the chamber through an illusionary door and stood before an old man sitting on a throne. The man had a red crown that dripped blood into his long white hair, coming down the sides of his head and mixing in with his long white beard. The throne was made of gold and had consumed most of his body. This left his head, hands and feet the only thing visible, and sat on a heap of jewelry and artifacts that no mortal should possess. The perimeter of the chamber was covered with piles of gold coin, stacked taller than one can imagine, and an open ceiling into the night that had stars that shouldn't exist. The old man spoke. "What do you have to offer besides your life?" The holy man stood across from him with his claymore resting against his shoulder, without saying a word. "You stand in the presence of greed without tribute. I do not care how you have made your way into my quarters, but you will go no further. Your soul will be mine." With a snap of greed's fingers, the piles of coins started dwindling down. Gold humanoid beings sluggishly pulled themselves from the bottom of the piles of coin. The holy man sprung into action, lowered his claymore, and broke into a sprint towards Greed. Greed smiled and tapped the armrest of his throne twice with his right middle finger as a void opened where his chest would be. The air pulsed, flaying the holy man's skin from his body and making it hang from the back of his mask like a cape. It was not enough to stop his inexorable drive. The gold monstrosities grabbed a hold of the skin, flailing behind him, and ripped it off. But he did not falter. Two more stood before him to block his path to Greed. The skinless holy man swung his claymore at the left minion at an upward angle and cut it clean from its waist to its shoulder, then back down, splitting the right one in half down the middle. "You're undeserving of such power," yelled Greed. His feet burrowed into the heap of artifacts below him, and two spikes burst from the floor behind the holy man. Both spikes impaled the holy man through the back of his shoulders and raised him in the air. Greed's eyes went black, and the stars rained down from the darkness above. They shot through the holy man like small balls of fire and left his body riddled with holes that were scorched around the edges. But the holy man would not die. Greed's golden minions climbed the spires, then liquefied themselves on the holy man and turned him into a gold statue. Greed brought the holy man closer by using the spires he made with his feet to impale him, and inquired about his new findings. The iron mask was ugly compared to his crown, so he had one of his minions break off the holy man's head and toss it to the side. The rosary is what caught his attention. "This must be where his power lies," said Greed, as he had a minion break off the holy man's arm, wielding his claymore, then placed it on Greed's throne. Greed tapped his right index finger on his throne, making his minions and the gold covering the holy man melt away. He then retracted his feet and let what was left of the holy man's skinless body drop to the ground. "I can never get that spell right. Always a piece still hanging on," said Greed, admiring the holy man's skinless arm that was still gripping his claymore. The holy man's limb levitated in front of Greed, but his face grew sour. He watched the rosary and claymore turn black and crumble before him. "What is this black magic?" cried Greed, before his head fell onto the seat of the throne where his lap would be. The holy man walked in front of Greed's throne and crouched down, making himself eye level. The holy man noticed a twitch of Greed's finger and immediately rose to his feet while swinging his claymore in an upward motion, bisecting Greed and his throne up the middle. The throne fell to both sides of the red crown that sat upon Greed's head, turned into blood and drizzled into the pile of artifacts below them. Shortly after, a red vine shot into the darkness above, where the stars were no more. The holy man placed his free hand on the massive red vine and watched the word Greed illuminate all over his arm, then disappeared, showing remnants of unscarred skin as a tear fell from under his mask. He looked down at his right hand, carrying the claymore, with thorned rosary binding them together, and let it drop next to him. The holy man began digging his fingers into the vine, making it bleed, and started climbing. His claymore dangled from the rosary, causing it to shred his forearm, while the claymore etched patterns in the back of his legs as it swayed back and forth. The holy man climbed through the seemingly eternal darkness, covered in his and the vine's blood, for what felt like an eternity. He climbed up until the face of the iron mask clanked against a ceiling where the vine suddenly ended. The holy man swung his claymore up with his forearm that was torn through to the muscle and caught it in his hand. He then jumped down onto the stone-cold floor of the labyrinth as his arm and leg began to heal. Moans and groaning could be heard throughout the passage that had a random assortment of items placed against the walls leading straight to the garden. The first item he had come across was a painting on the wall. It had a male and a female contorted into a frame while being intimate with a canvas made of stretched skin that was woven into the bodies of the couple with tendons. The frame shifted and moaned while they dripped blood onto the canvas that took the shape of a bleeding heart. Lost souls that had given in to their greatest sin only to relinquish their bodies and humanity for eternal pleasure. So much suffering. The holy man used his free hand to rip the painting from the wall and pried the two souls apart. Their sins burned themselves onto his skin, and he pressed forward to the next item, while tears fell. It was a male rearranged into a dresser, with his head sitting on the top, groaning in pleasure. His drawers vigorously went in and out on their own, with blood and pus seeping out from the sides and onto the ground. The holy man slid his claymore through the top of the man's head to silence him, then gave it a turn. Another soul, another sin, another scar, and another tear. A bed sat in the middle of the passage and went from wall to wall, blocking his path. He approached the bed with caution, seeing that it too was a monstrosity. It was composed of 4 men and 2 women. The men's bodies were spiraled into bedposts that stood at each corner, with one of the women's bodies stretched out into a mattress with her face in the middle. The other woman was made into a headboard with her face in the middle as well, and her breasts placed at the head of the bed like pillows, all bearing faces of pleasure while their bodies squirmed. The holy man had enough of the heresy set before him and cut the bed in half. At the drop of his claymore, the bed screamed in pleasure and pain, clearing the way for the holy man and adding yet another handful of sins to his body. Tears fell from under the holy man's mask as he cut through the remaining items to end their torment. Each one left the word lust on his body until they were no more. The holy man entered the chamber of the garden once more and was greeted by the little girl. "You made it. Now we can continue our conversation. Please come and take a dip. You're filthy." The holy man looked down at his scarred, naked body that was covered in blood and headed in the direction of the pond. As before, a different group of children were present. This time he entered the chamber, and then the garden itself seemed even more beautiful than before. The holy man stepped into the pond and submerged himself in the water while the little girl swung on her swing. "You know, it's quite rude to leave in the middle of a story," said the little girl, clearing her throat. Where was I? Oh, that's right. So the being merged us into one and made us whole. It let us push on as one mind, one body, but 2 souls. I was no longer a liability, and he was free to climb the tower, forever feeling my touch. I was also no longer scared. The little girl paused when the holy man exited the pond. Not many make it past this floor, as they are all welcomed. It won't stop your progress, and neither will I, for the sins and the tower have an agenda of their own, said the little girl, pointing at the dark archway leading to the next chamber. The holy man rested his claymore against his shoulder and pushed on. He passed through the archway into an empty chamber made of writhing flesh. The walls and floor were made of countless bodies, melted together as they squirmed and moaned as one. Their hands reached up, groping the holy man all over where he stood, while he scanned the room for the being the little girl spoke of. The holy man pointed his claymore downward and plunged it into the living floor, making the bodies quiver below him as they retreated from his blade. He then lifted his claymore from out of the ground to watch the stone floor be covered again with the bodies of many. Out of curiosity, the holy man made a circle around him with his blade, with the same effect, but this time a voice mix of male and female echoed throughout the chamber. "Please do not hurt my children. They just want to entice you." The being the little girl spoke of materialized before him from the flesh below. The creature was a male on its left side and a female on the right. It had the genitals of both sexes, with one inside the other and lacked a face altogether, except for a large blue eye that sat in the middle of its head. The skin of the being was a porcelain white that secreted a violet viscous from the top of its head and down its back to the floor below, where it blended with the room itself. It sent a wave of ripples from its head, through its hair and down into the floor as it spoke. You may refer to me as Master, but I feel like you know what I am, Old One. The wave of ripples flowed into the fleshy floor below and made their way to the feet of the holy man. A lesser version of the being began to materialize at his feet and stop at his waist as it gazed up at him with a face of one of the poor lost souls she had already taken for her own. The body in front of the holy man spoke and prodded at his crotch with his finger, while the hands of many caressed his lower half. So, there's no need for a formal introduction. Are you not aroused? The holy man lifted his claymore that was resting at his side, drove it down through the being in front of him and into the stone floor below. The being dissolved back into the fleshy floor and created a circle around the holy man's blade. With a twist of his sword, he crumbled the ground under his blade and gripped his claymore with the flat side facing the humanoid creature. You disrespect lust in its own domain. Do you not seek joke? The holy man stepped in front of his claymore with his left foot, then used his right to help his blade throw the crumbled stone below at Lust. Lust's body immediately lost shape and the eye dropped into the sludge below. Waves rippled in all directions, but the mass of one in particular caught the holy man's attention. The holy man broke into a sprint to the ripple, heading to the closest wall. With his blade at his side, he raised the claymore overhead and brought it down in front of the one he assumed was the avatar of Lust, to cut off its path, and that he did. The holy man then kicked up where the ripple had stopped before his blade. The eye of Lust was launched into the hands, reaching out of the wall, with the holy man following up by bringing his blade around his side. A lesser Lust materialized itself in between the holy man's claymore and the eye of Lust to block the attack, but his blade stayed true. The holy man's claymore passed right through its body as it wore a face of passion and cut the eye in half. While the hands were retracting into the wall, the moans turned to screams, making the holy man's eardrums burst and bled down from under his iron mask. The holy man's claymore clashed into the wall and crumbled a portion of it to reveal a corridor hidden behind it. The fleshy borders of the chamber went flat and fell from the walls and ceiling onto the floor, then spilled into the neighbouring corridor. The holy man rested his claymore against his shoulder and lurched through the sludge to the next passage. It was a skywalk with windows along both sides and an iron gate on the other end. The holy man walked into the middle and peered off both sides. Each side was a side of the tower he was climbing, and he was now on the 4th level. When he looked off to each side, there was nothing but the curvature of the tower. He looked out to see the sun setting over the snowy mountains. He travelled to get to the tower. His hearing came back just in time to listen to lust's screams die out as the word lust illuminated on his body, then faded away, while a tear fell from under his iron mask. The holy man continued across the skywalk and through the gate into complete darkness. The gate slammed behind him as the light disappeared with the door. The holy man reached out in front of him and felt a stone wall, then continued to feel around to the sides only to feel the same. It was about an arm's distance all around. The ground began to soften, and the holy man's feet started sinking into the ground. He used his claymore to make 3 slashes in the ground around him, but the ground ate the gashes he left. The holy man stuck his claymore in the wall, with the flat side of his claymore perpendicular to the ground, and tried to pull his lower half free. His skin stretched thin before separating at the waist. The holy man's pelvis dislocated from his spine, then his lower half was ingested by the ground below. The holy man's guts spilled onto the ground and were eaten as well. The wall he had stuck his claymore into started to ripple and suck in his blade. The holy man saw no other solution but to give himself to the strange room. He closed his eyes, knowing there was one of 2 outcomes. Either he'd end up face to face with the source of this magic, or spend an eternity trapped inside the walls of the tower. The holy man's crushed upper body was spit out of the ceiling and dropped into a new chamber, falling headfirst into the nothingness below. He fell long enough for his bones to reset and for his lower half to reanimate again. The scrapes and scratches didn't always heal. He wasn't sure if it wasn't a reminder of his duty, or the life that was left behind centuries ago, when he was still human. No matter. After hours of falling, the cavern began to shrink, and jagged clusters of stone closed in from the sides. The holy man turned to his body, so the first thing to hit was his back. He struck a set of jagged stone with his back, splitting it open and making his body go limp. His body struck several more objects on his way down and broke the majority of his bones, before finally landing on a mountain of bodies. He tumbled down with a formless body for another unmeasurable amount of time, until he hit the base of the pile of corpses. Intense muttering was heard as something draped in a long dingy cloth headed in his direction on what seemed to be many legs of all colours and sizes. It was bulbous on their end, facing him, and some of the legs didn't touch the ground as they mimicked the motions of those that did. It stopped in front of him, with its large circular side facing him. It was a being of many faces, many bodies, and many souls. It picked and prodded at the holy man's body as it examined the new addition to its collection, with its many hands attached to the arms extending from two of its front torsos. The bulbous part of the body was a honeycomb of many green, sickly heads, all talking amongst each other. I wish we had its head. I wish this arm was mine. I wish we had their scars. It muttered to itself. The sound of the holy man's bones snapping back in place startled the monster, constructed of many, and made it rear back. Its numerous torsos arched back as its countless hands, all wielding weapons and enchanted items of those it had made its own, laid waste to the holy man's body. They pierced, bludgeoned, scorched, electrified, and froze him in unison. The attack left nothing behind but his skeletal remains and the iron mask lying in a crater of unstable magic in the mountain of bodies. One of the being's free hands grabbed a hold of the holy man's iron mask, then tried to place the mask on a handful of the many heads. It tried and tried until it landed on a child's that it fit loosely on as it giggled in its many voices. The head bobbed back and forth in its compartment while the iron mask shook loosely on its head, and then it burst into a ball of white flames. The being screamed in agony as it did its best to shake out the holy flame, but it continued to burn until there was a smouldering black crater where the child's head previously sat. The disgrace scurried back and hid amongst the mountain of bodies. Dead man hurt us. Why did he hurt me? More pain, please, cried the many faces as they watched the holy man begin to reanimate from the inside of the iron mask. The being crawled up next to him and watched the process unfold before its many sets of eyes. When the holy man was finally whole, he thrusted his claymore at the beast and stabbed it through one of its chests. He then ripped his blade out its side and separated it from the rest of its body. It screamed in pain as it trampled the holy man with its many feet, and his body was broken once again. The being used one of its free hands to pick him up and place the holy man's limp body against its own. The entity's body absorbed the holy man's trampled body before he could regenerate. As he merged with the monstrosity, the being's torso made space and integrated the holy man's body into itself. The holy man's arms moved along the body until they fell in place alongside the other countless limbs. His head made its way up through the torso and forced itself through the black crater left behind from the previous head. The holy man felt his mind start to be corrupted with thoughts of another. We take what I want. What I need is what we must have. Embrace envy and have everything. Envy was trying to forcefully piece together the torso that the holy man had severed, but the portion that his blade had cut through rendered it useless. Why does this body not work? I want it back. This isn't fair. The beast cried as the holy man's head jerked amongst the many. All the faces of envy looked to the holy man's head that violently seized in place Why? 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 The holy man's head came to a halt, turned into stone and crumbled inside the iron mask. Envy wailed as the iron mask tumbled to the ground, once again leaving the black crater that was now replaced with stone. It spread to the rest of the heads at a relentless speed. Envy dropped whatever items it was holding in its many hands and began ripping off the other heads to stop the spread. One by one, the heads were ripped out of their resting places, but it wasn't enough. The magic had already spread down it to its body, freezing the front half of its many torsos, leaving the rest kicking until the abomination was converted into stone altogether. The holy man's body reanimated in time for him to watch the rest of Envy's twitching mass succumb to the magic and crumble before him. The word envy illuminated all over his body, then faded away, exposing more clear skin, hiding underneath the scar tissue of sin, while another tear fell from under his mask. The holy man rested his claymore against his shoulder and walked over to the crumbled beast. He scanned the chamber to see a vast emptiness, accompanied by the mountain of corpses and himself. The holy man turned to the mountain and spent days climbing it in hope of seeing something from the top he had failed to notice before. He scanned the chamber once again until he felt the bodies under him start to slide down. The holy man staggered on the top of the mountain, trying to catch his footing, but the bodies were being sucked in through the middle and straight down the centre of the corpses mountain he stood on. The holy man grasped for anything as he was engulfed by the bodies of the mountain. He was passed through a tunnel of corpses for what felt like hours, maybe days. With his arms stuck above his head, he caught glimpses of the garden chamber as he saw it before and for what it really was. The little girl watched from her swing as more children played in the garden until he could see them no more. The bodies gradually turned into orange sand until he fell into a desert of a chamber from a small hole above. The holy man plummeted below and bounced off the sand as a glass bubble appeared around him. He lay there covered in orange dust until his body healed and a wooden tube grew out of the sand in front of him. He got up and looked around to see a sandstorm hindering his view of the outside of his bubble. Then he looked up to see that he was in the bottom half of an hourglass, bodies and sand falling together to the ground from where he had entered the chamber. The holy man placed his free hand against the bubble and it passed right through. So he walked out altogether. The sandstorm relentlessly ate away at his body as he looked out into the distance. There were hundreds of bubbles spread throughout the chamber, with a large mound of sand on the other side that had large cloth perched on the top and flowing with the wind. He made his way in the direction of the mound, with the sandstorm tearing away at his body. The holy man stopped at one of the bubbles to check what was inside and was greeted with more heresy. There was an engorged man on his hands and knees with his mouth around the wooden tube. The tube was filling him up with an unknown substance that slowly enlarging him before the holy man's eyes. The holy man went to end the man's suffering, but was halted when he tried to enter the man's bubble. The holy man used the tip of his claymore to pierce into the bubble and into the back distended man inside. The man popped and covered the inside of the bubble in his remains as bile continued to flow from the tube left behind. The sandstorm pulsed, shredding a good portion of the holy man's skin, while another sin was added to his body, followed by a tear that turned to mud. The storm was getting worse and making it harder for the holy man to push forward, but he persisted. Sand was pouring out from the bottom of his mask, while he made his way to the next bubble to see a woman residing inside, with both of her legs broken. She was still fresh compared to the man in the other bubble he had come across, for she was not bloated like him at all. She looked over to see the holy man standing on the outside of her bubble, with bile falling from her mouth. Her eyes were filled with tears as a new hope was looking over her. She cried out, "Oh, thank the Lord," and was instantly obliterated by another pulse of the storm. As she crawled out to embrace the holy man looked to the mound and watched the cloth get taken up by the sandstorm as remnants of the woman blew from his feet. The holy man continued on to the next bubble to rid another soul trapped in eternal suffering. He was cut off by the cloth riding the sandstorm and presented itself before him. It was a naked man like himself, with a blanket of skin flowing behind him. "Why must you ruin my food?" the skin man asked, standing before the holy man. The holy man stood soundless, with his claymore resting on his shoulder. The skin man continued, "Do you lack a tongue to speak, or do you choose to ignore gluttony?" The holy man stepped towards Gluttony with his claymore down at his side and gripping the handle with both hands. "So be it," said Gluttony, as he was taken by the sandstorm just in time to evade the holy man's downswing of his blade. Then appeared behind him. The holy man felt his presence and swung his claymore wide, while using the flow of the sandstorm to quicken his swing. As he turned around, Gluttony used his excess skin to wrap around and catch the holy man's right arm, lifted his body, then continuously slammed him into the ground before throwing him at another glass bubble. The holy man used his claymore to get to one knee, then tilted the blade back to pierce the bubble behind him and burst another trapped soul. A tear caked with orange sand fell from his eye as another scar appeared on his body. Gluttony was sent into a rage. "Leave my food alone." He charged the holy man and engulfed him in his loose skin. The holy man's arms were bound to his sides as Gluttony constricted him, showing an impression of his iron mask on his skin. The holy man's bones cracked and protruded from his skin before Gluttony let loose and dropped him to the ground. Gluttony stood next to him and expanded his mouth to the size of the holy man as his jaw lowered to the ground. The holy man's body began fixing itself, with the bones in his right arms snapping back into place first. With his hand still gripping his claymore, he leaned over, making his broken ribs pierce through his lungs, and sliced Gluttony's bottom jaw off. Gluttony recoiled back, retracting his loose skin, and scooped at his lower jaw that had fallen flat in the sand into his jawless mouth. The holy man's body jerked as it mended his bones while rising to his feet. Gluttony wrapped his skin around the holy man's head before he had a chance to fight again, and rode the current of the wind. This time he was dragging the holy man through the sands. This scrubbed away his scarred skin and muscle from his bone, while his claymore dangled behind him. The holy man used all his might to pry himself from Gluttony, but not in time before his neck dislocated from his spine. This rendered his body useless for the time being. Gluttony had whipped around and let go of the holy man, making his scoured body skip into the sands. The holy man laid in the sands, waiting for his discombobulated body to regenerate itself, with Gluttony nowhere to be seen. He stared up through the storm at the faint hole in the middle of the hourglass-shaped chamber, watching bodies fall like grains of sand. Those that were dead simply bounced off the sand before settling in. Others that aren't so lucky fall in like himself, but do not have the luxury of regeneration, therefore leaving them battered and broken. The only thing keeping them going was an everlasting source of food. So much suffering. Sand gradually fell in the direction of his feet, catching the holy man's attention. He sat up to see the glass bubbles start to roll down as the decline increased by the second. The holy man rose to his feet and made his way to the closest wall as quickly as he could. But it was fruitless. A glass bubble cascaded down and the holy man dug his feet into the sand before using his claymore to split it in two. The damned soul inside ruptured, covering the holy man in bile and viscera, blocking his vision from seeing the other behind it. Another soul, another scar, and a tear for the damned. The second bubble smashed into the holy man and made him tumble to the ground. He was standing on was now in front of him. He grabbed onto a wooden tube, but it gave with ease, while the rotation of the chamber continued to speed up. The sand made a vortex as it went through the hole and started filling the other half of the hourglass chamber. The holy man let his claymore dangle from his rosary once again as he landed on a glass bubble. He hugged it to keep himself from sliding off, with his claymore hanging from his side. He balanced himself on top of the hourglass bubble, trying to stay above the orange vortex below, with the cyclone's stand still tearing away at him. The holy man leaped from bubble to bubble until he was able to jump and dig his claymore into the wall of the chamber to hold himself in place until the last of the sand trickled down. He could see Gluttony sitting on the bottom of the other section of the chamber, ingesting all that fell. Gluttony was now an immense mound of flesh that filled up the entire bottom of the hourglass-shaped chamber. His slack skin was no more, and without his jaw, the sand and glass bubbles fell into an abyss. The holy man pushed off the wall with his foot to free his blade and plunged feet first into the lower portion of the chamber where Gluttony fed. He fell with his claymore overhead and brought it down on Gluttony's face. The holy man continued to fall as his blade passed through the disgusting mountain of flesh and severing every organ and bone in its path. The holy man's legs snapped on impact when landing in the mess of sand, viscera, and remains of those left from the glass bubbles that were no more. He sat atop of his crumbled legs as he watched Gluttony spewed blood with every pump of his massive, lacerated heart. The holy man stood as soon as his legs mended themselves and used his blade to cut the arteries holding its heart in place. He then cut open his stomach and placed it inside. He watched as Gluttony's stomach acid boiled over and his heart disintegrated in the sludge. A dirty tear fell from his eye, caked with sand, and the word Gluttony illuminated all over his body and disappeared. He looked at the top of his free hand to see scarless skin for the first time in centuries. The holy man looked down at his feet as he felt the contents of Gluttony's stomach start to eat away at them. Bones were beginning to show, and before he knew it, the ground he stood on opened up. The stomach acid had eaten through Gluttony itself and dropped the holy man into the labyrinth once again. The holy man was in another stone corridor with identical rooms spread out evenly on both sides, and the opening in the ceiling gone. He pressed forward with his claymore resting on his shoulder and leaving bloody footprints as his feet regrew, the muscles and skin with every step. The holy man walked through the labyrinth that took the shape of a dungeon. Every room he passed was vacant as he progressed through the hallway that seemed to have no end. He spent days walking through the hall into the eternal darkness, while it all stayed the same. The scent of grass filled his nostrils, making the holy man stop in his tracks. He peered into the rooms next to him to see nothing but empty stone boxes. The holy man turned his head around to see the archway into the garden now behind him. He made his way to the entrance and stood in the opening, examining everything inside. The little girl on the swing excitedly looked in his direction. "Didn't think we'd be graced with your presence after our last encounter. You look filthy. Come, wash off. Come. The holy man stood in the archway covered in orange dust, bile and blood. He let the point of his blade drop to the ground and dragged it behind him as he entered the chamber, while everything his claymore touched turned into rot. He made his way in her direction, noticing a new set of children ran around him, playing like nothing was happening. The little girl's smile disappeared as she stopped swinging and spoke. We ascended the tower as one, and when we had made it to the top, we were both still granted deepest desires. She continued as the holy man pressed forward. My brother had wished for us to be separated, but to never be separable. Where I had wished to become one with the tower, for it had become our home. The holy man had made his way in front of the pond across from her, before stopping behind him with a trail of rot through the grass and garden itself. She looked to the chained head above before speaking again. I am not sin, nor mortal, but merely here to maintain the labyrinth and hinder those from scaling the tower itself, while he stayed my protector. The holy man looked up at the head suspended above as it looked down at him, shaking in anger. It was letting out a silent scream, but the holy man paid no mind. He turned his attention to the little girl once more. I did not lie to you. The sins set before you will do everything in their power to end you. That is, if they so choose. My task is to make the labyrinth resistant to your travels. The little girl glided her arm in front of her, drawing the holy man's attention to the pond. You are not the only one transcending this tower, as you know. I am having conversations with many where you stand as we speak, all at the same time, all at different points in time. Instances of different individuals, pairs and bands of all kinds seeking the top of the tower are standing around him and relaxing in the new blood-red pond in front of him. Some had their weapons drawn and were answering to her stone protectors. The little girl continued, the tower gains its power through all your sorrows, and the children are what keep me eternal. The holy man made his way around the pond as he caught a glimpse of the garden in its true form. The children were bone thin and were running in a garden of the deceased children from before. Their bodies looked as if they never aged, but their lives were drained from them, as if they have. The blue sky above was a cracked mural of the sky itself. The holy man extended his claymore and placed the edge on the little girl's shoulder to show a reflection of her true self on his silver blade. She was a skeletal being with flesh peeling from her face. The holy man let the weight of his claymore cut into her shoulder, and she gripped his wrist with her cold fingers to steady the blade. Again, we cannot stop progression. A stone sword was thrown by one of the statues that crashed into the right side of the holy man and drove his body into the ground of the rotted chamber. All that was left was his right arm clinching the claymore in the little girl's hand, and his head sticking out of the ground at an angle where his body nowhere to be seen. The little girl finished, but we can break your will, brother. She looked up at the suspended head above. Throw him into the next chamber. We'll let the boy deal with him. The little girl tossed the holy man's arm to the side, while one of the statues picked up its stone sword with one hand and scooped up the holy man's head with the other. It drew its arm back and threw the head at the wall with all its might, making the holy man's head burst into the adjacent chamber. His head skipped off the floor and spun on its side before coming to rest. Still conscious, his eyes fell on a crumbled pillar in front of him once the dizziness settled. The chamber he had landed in was in shambles. For what he could see in the darkness, the holy man heard a grunt from behind, and his head shook with every step as it grew closer. Whatever was approaching spoke with malice. I have waited all this time for this. The holy man's head lifted into the air and was made to face the one holding it. It was a behemoth of a man, whose exposed red muscles stretched its skin so thin it had torn in numerous places. It looked to be wearing a child's face, from how loose it sat, small, on a muscular neck. The behemoth brought the holy man's face close to his, and stared into the eye holes of his iron mask. The holy man stared back, with the words wrath and sloth scarred on his filthy face, and on his eyeballs themselves. How dare the tower take this away from me? Roared the behemoth, spitting in the holy man's face. It took the holy man's head in between its massive hands and tried to crush it, with no prevail. Hundreds of years wasted on nothing. The holy man's vision blurred as the behemoth cocked back its arm and spiked his face into the ground below. The behemoth stomped and stomped on the back of the holy man's head, with each foot burying his face deeper, while it whined, "This isn't fair. I wanted one thing, just one bloody thing." The holy man's head was hoisted in the air once again, with the rubble falling from his eye holes. The behemoth threw his head to the ground, again making it land face up, then drove his fingers into the eye holes of the iron mask. Blood fell like tears from his eyes, while his head swayed from side to side in the behemoth's fingers. Wherever it was going didn't matter, for all the holy man could feel was its fingers making a slush of his brain from wiggling back and forth until he blacked out. The holy man came to, with the behemoth wailing in pain. "Am I not damned enough?" He was conscious again, but his sight was still gone. The behemoth's fingers were still lodged in his eye sockets, so he just waited and listened. All the holy man could hear were the sobs of the behemoth, while the massive fists beat into his face of his mask. One after another, his brain bounced around his skull, while the monster cried for days, until it all of a sudden came to a halt. The ground rumbled with each step it took away from the holy man's head, while its roaring voice trailed off. "I sit here, waiting, letting all those puny mortals pass. For what? This?" The holy man let his body mend itself as soon as he heard the behemoth stop on the other side of the chamber. The behemoth's fingers were pushed out of his eye sockets first and plopped on the ground below. His eye sockets glowed white before his eyeballs reanimated themselves. His eyes fell on the giant monster sitting on the other side of the chamber, with its face buried in its knees. A silhouette of light took the form of the holy man's body before it reanimated, while he listened to the behemoth cry. His claymore forged itself from the light in his hand once his body was back, then used his blade to cut around his head to free himself from the wall. The holy man dropped to his feet, catching the behemoth's attention. "My wish has come true." The behemoth jumped to its feet with tears pouring from its eyes and charged the holy man, screaming, "I spent years climbing this tower because of you." The behemoth threw its right fist at the holy man's face, but he ducked under the swing. The holy man now behind the monster in motion and bringing his claymore up to the monster's back. The behemoth's fist made contact with the wall and blasted rubble in all directions, then spun around with the back of its fist swinging wide. The holy man caught the back of his fist with the side of his face before he could raise his blade fast enough and had his head batted down to the ground. The behemoth grabbed him by the leg and threw his body against the wall, crushing bones and rupturing organs. The holy man got to his hands and knees with blood pouring out from the eye hole and bottom of the iron mask. "Do you know how long I've waited for this very moment?" yelled the behemoth as it drew back its leg and drove it into the holy man's side. The holy man's back bounced off the wall before his body fell to the ground again. His ribs turned blackish purple around the scars still present. The holy man was lifted into the air by one of his legs and was brought to face level of the behemoth with his claymore dangling under him by the thorned rosary. "You deemed us the heretics as you came without word and massacred my village in the name of God. We had no army, but you treated the farmers as soldiers if they did not bow before your cross. My father was a God-fearing man, and he had every right to be, for your presence under God's will is far more evil than anything on this earth." The holy man's body mended itself enough by the time the behemoth stopped spitting in his face. He yanked up his claymore by the rosary, caught it in his hand and swung at the behemoth's waist. It was a futile attempt as the beast caught the holy man by his forearm and crushed it in his hand. It then ripped off his arm and tossed it to the side before vociferating, "I will end you like you did my father. I will make you regret letting the orphan you created walk away with his life. You will regret filling me with the rage that guided me up this tower. For I am wrath, and you will feel the hate I have grown for you." Wrath grabbed the holy man under his remaining arm with his free hand and raised him above his head. "God won't save you." The holy man's body was stretched apart from both ends and showered wrath with his blood and guts. He tossed both halves of the holy man's body behind him, then made his way to the wall the holy man's head had entered through. Wrath placed his hand against the wall, looking for the way he had entered. Wrath protested, "I have fulfilled my destiny. Now let me leave this bloody prison." He lay there in two as the upper half reanimated and his claymore followed suit. His body jerked while he used his claymore to rise to his feet. Wrath turned to see the frail holy man standing before him once again and let out a deathly wail before charging. He stood with both hands loosely gripping his claymore, with his legs shaking under him. Wrath quickly closed the distance as he towered over the holy man with his arms extended in front of him. The holy man tightened his stance, dropped down and drove his claymore into Wrath's belly. As he grasped at the air overhead, the holy man then spun his body to the right, making his blade glide through and out the left side of Wrath's torso. Wrath dropped to a knee while holding his side, with the holy man ending his attack behind him. The holy man grasped his claymore with his left hand and unravelled some of his rosary. It was time to end his suffering. The holy man placed his knee on his back, wrapped the thorned rosary around Raph's muscular neck and wrenched back. The rosary violently cut into Raph's throat and the holy man's forearm. Raph swung his left arm back to grab at the holy man and his right to pry at the rosary, but his two missing fingers hindered him greatly. The holy man used his claymore to stab Raph in the left shoulder and severed his arm from his body. Raph gurgled in pain and fell to his side, with the holy man sawing through his neck as the rosary cut to the bone. With one final pull, Raph's head rolled to the ground into a puddle of blood. The holy man rose to his feet, then looked down at the behemoth's lifeless body that spewed blood from its neck. Tears fell from under his iron mask and mixed with the blood below. He crouched down to pick up its small head off the ground by the hair so he could get a clearer look at his face. The head slipped from its skin, so the only thing he brought up was a flesh mask. All the suffering he has ended without leaving a face to recognise. The holy man rewound the rosary in place, plucked the behemoth's head with his claymore, then jabbed it into his heart. He looked up at the dark ceiling with a single tear falling from under his mask. The word wrath illuminated all over his body, then disappeared, leaving the only sin left. The ground was taken from under his feet as the holy man was yanked to the ceiling. He landed on his back with his arms splayed out. Little by little, all the rubble from the ground below did the same. Raph's body fell up and landed directly on him, with the stone foundation below, soon to follow. Each stone broke away a part of the ceiling that was keeping the holy man from falling into what lay behind him. Raph was pummeled by stone after stone until the ceiling under the holy man cracked. The ceiling gave, sending the holy man flipping into another abyss as he watched Wrath float next to him with the debris into the endless void. The holy man flipped and spun until he finally levelled out without knowing which direction he was facing or drifting. Raph's body deconstructed and began to merge with the debris. The two twisted and turned as tendons wove everything together, while the muscles held them in place to form the little girl swinging on a skeletal tree. She and the tree were made from what was left of the sin and its chamber, bringing a variant of herself before the holy man. The holy man gripped his claymore in both hands, but realised that he had no way to engage. He was in a stasis. The avatar of the tower spoke. "You are very persistent, aren't you? What is it that you seek at the end of your journey?" The holy man stared blankly in her direction, with both hands clasping his claymore. The little girl spoke again. "Of course, nothing. You fail to understand. I am not here to stop you from obtaining your wish. Help me, help you, yes?" The holy man lowered his blade to his side as he floated before her. The little girl and the tree began to circle around the holy man. "Good. You do not fit in our home like the others, so your presence is quite unsettling. this high in the tower, not to mention your gift and lack of tongue, make you rather difficult to deal with. Even if you had completed your journey at this point, all that you knew before entering this tower is no more. Apparitions of others climbing the tower appeared around him. Some stood victorious, while others fell to their sins, but all were now a part of the tower. The holy man stood expressionless to all that was being shown to him, and this frustrated the little girl greatly. Her body began to fall apart into pieces that were drifting around them. So be it. If I cannot rid you from this world, then I will bury you beneath this tower. May you rest in disgrace as your God watches over your helpless soul. The rest of the little girl and the tree dematerialized and collected around his body like a stone casket. He plummeted down through the abyss, and all the holy man could do was listen in his dark prison. His descent through the tower was violent. Each floor he impacted shook him within until he burrowed into the foundation of the tower below. The holy man's stone casket rumbled while it broke through everything before he came to a halt and leaving him with a nothing but time. He closed his eyes as his lungs struggled to find air with each breath. From there his mind went blank. The holy man's body was reanimated from the inside of his iron mask and pushed the corpse out of its way. Then did it again and again, a torment he had known all too well. The holy man did this for decades under the ever-shifting labyrinth until there was a layer of lifeless bodies under the tower. He reanimated once more to feel the ground against his back again. To give. He pushed up on his hands and knees as the ground above gave way into a blinding light. The holy man was on his knees, with half of his body sticking out of the ground and filling his new lungs with air for the first time. Almost if he had forgotten what it was like to breathe, an unfamiliar voice of an elderly gentleman rang out, catching his attention. Oh, to be blessed with the presence of a legend. The holy man rose to his feet and held his claymore at his side, with the point in the ground and his left hand resting on the pommel, facing the direction of the voice. You stand vigorous after such a long slumber, and I see my name on your skin. Speak, child, what of you? The holy man's eyes finished adjusting, for them to fall on a woman with sucked-in eyes, holding an infant with skin that had a light blue hue. She was as pale as can be, and wore nothing with the infant sucking on her breast. Her mouth was agape, with the elderly gentleman's voice projecting from it. Ah, the legend is true. The one who wears man's sins on his flesh does not speak beneath the mask. I was beginning to think of you as a myth to keep us sins in check. The woman began to circle around the holy man with her unmoving mouth. He stood still while it spoke. The tower, or that little girl, rather, has been intervening with your climb since you have entered her chamber. Your cryptic nature unsettles it, and your gifts have made you quite a valiant, yet a disgusting foe. Let's not forget you're a man of God, or so to speak. The body of the woman began to change shape as old bones cracked. and new bones formed. Her lower half extended out to the rear and stretched its skin thin, while a second pair of legs grew from underneath. The holy man shifted his hand to the grip of his claymore, while the centaur continued to circle around him. I'd say cursed from the looks of it. One man's curse is another's blessing, from what I see here. May every death be a bonding moment as I enjoy every second of your eternal damnation. The woman grew another set of arms under those holding the infant. One was pointed at the end, with the other formed into a spiked ball, where the hand would be. The woman reared back while giving off a deathly wail and disorientating the holy man before charging in. Blood drizzled from under the holy man's mask, but he stood strong. He flipped his claymore around and held it in front of him, with both hands on the grip. The woman reached over and swung the spiked ball at the holy man. He ducked under her spiked fist, and her pointed arm ricocheted off his iron mask. The holy man turned to face the abomination at the ready. As the woman turned on her haunches, it charged the holy man again, with its spikes hand raised above his head. The holy man brought his claymore straight down as it swung in his direction, in passing, and severed the limb at the elbow, then brought his blade around and caught his hind legs in one motion. The elder's voice echoed in the chamber, "Gah!" while the woman's back end dragged on the ground before taking up another shape. The holy man caught the transition and immediately engaged with his claymore at his side. The rear of the woman became bulbous as 4 legs shot out from each side of her new body, with the old legs absorbing back into the body. The holy man swung, but the woman jumped onto the wall in front of them and scurried to the side. The holy man watched as it crawled along the wall and jumped at him. He placed his free hand on the flat side of his claymore to brace for impact. The woman landed on him with its spider's legs, jabbing blindly into the holy man's sides. He fought to keep it from crushing him, and it shoved him to the side as it staggered to its feet. He used his claymore to pin the woman's thorax to the ground, but it pulled away, splitting in half. The abomination let out another wail as the holy man clasped his claymore and continued his assault. He dragged it along the ground while it tried to keep its distance for another transition, but the holy man never gave it a chance. It crawled back up the wall and produced another thorax, while keeping a distance from the holy man himself. The spider woman pried stones from the chamber walls with her extra limbs and hucked them at the holy man. He used his claymore to cut through them as they came, but he couldn't catch all of them. One stone bounced off the ground of the chamber and bashed his knee in, making it buckle back and dropping him to one knee. The abomination saw the advantage and crawled across the chamber floor to the adjacent wall, while using one of its legs to slice the holy man's throat. While passing by, it watched the holy man spew blood onto his lap, then launched a stone at his head to make his neck open even more. The holy man used his free hand to keep his head from falling back, while the abomination made its way to him, while taking up the shape of a scorpion with a stinger overhead. Her extra limbs grew pinchers at the ends, while the others held the infant to her breast. The holy man's leg mended itself, and he went to swing his claymore in an upward motion, with his head moving loosely on its neck. The scorpion woman halted his attack by grabbing onto his right wrist with one claw and his head with the other to keep his neck from closing. It used its stinger to repeatedly impale the holy man's torso before driving it into the opening in his neck and making a slop of his insides, all while the infant drank from the woman's breast and watched from the corner of its eye. The holy man reached out with his free arm and yanked the infant from the woman by its arm. The woman whipped the holy man around on the end of her stinger and tossed him aside while scooping up the infant. It latched to its breast, then pointed in the direction of the holy man, whose body was almost whole again and ready to fight. It screamed in the elderly gentleman's voice, "How dare you? I will make you mine, for you will remain with sloth until the end of time," projected the elderly gentleman's voice from the woman's gaping mouth. The woman's lower torso shifted into a shapeless mass of tendrils, with her extra limbs following suit, while still holding the infant close. Sloth's mount towered over the holy man, who stood before it with his claymore held in front of him. The woman thrusted her tendrils at the holy man as she glided around the chamber. Each one that he caught with his blade was matched with another that punctured holes into his flesh, all while keeping a distance from his long blade. The holy man tracked its pattern and swung wide to part a tendril down the middle, then let go of his claymore at the end of his swing. The claymore pinned Sloth to its mount and into the wall, with the thorned rosary cinching around its forearm to the bone. Before it completely unravelled, the tendrils flailed, with Sloth screaming through the mouth of the woman. The holy man grabbed the woman by the tendrils, making up her lower half, and yanked her to the ground as the blade cut through Sloth and his mount with ease. The holy man raised his claymore above his head, then brought the flat side down on Sloth and the remainder of its mount, crushing them under the weight of his blade. The holy man lifted his claymore that was caked with viscera from the slain underneath and rested the blade against his shoulder. A tear fell from under the holy man's mask as he looked up to the ceiling of the chamber. The word sloth illuminated on his body, then faded away, leaving his skin rid of the sin. The chamber he was in began to melt away, and the garden came to be. It looked like it did when his eyes first fell upon it, with the little girl sitting on a swing attached to a tree. This time he stood on the other side of the pond, with no children in sight. The 7 statues that line the chamber stepped down from their pedestals and placed their hands on the guard of their stone swords that sat in front of them. The little girl spoke. "Behind you is a door out of the tower, if you so choose. If not, we unfortunately cannot risk you making your wish, for we do not know what the outcome is to be. If we are to lose our home, then we will go with it, and we are unwilling to give up what we have come to be. Our choice is yours." The holy man looked behind him to see a door ajar with light pouring in from the outside, then looked back at the little girl and took up his claymore in both hands. "So be it," said the little girl as 2 statues stepped in front of her and 5 stepped behind him. One of the statues swung its stone sword blade at the holy man as it dragged along the ground in his direction. He ran back between another statue's leg, making the stone sword crumble on one of the knees as he used his claymore to sever the foot of another at the ankle. The statue that had its knee shattered fell into another that had lost its foot as they crumbled to the ground. The holy man was kicked in the back by one of the 3 left standing behind him. He flew in the direction of the other 2, protecting the little girl, as one used its open hand to smack the holy man down into the pond. One of the stone guardians protecting the little girl reached in to grab him, but met his blade instead. The claymore sliced through the fingers, making them drop into the pond and on top of the holy man. The other statue reached in and threw him into the air, but he didn't come back down. The little girl looked up to see the angry, suspended head face to face with the holy man, who was now standing on the chains holding it up. She cried out as the statues fruitlessly reached up and grabbed at him. "Don't you dare touch him!" The holy man ran along the chain with his claymore at his side and used his blade to cut it up its chin, leaving the face splayed open. The statue swayed after the blow to the head, so he climbed up to the top, then plunged his blade into the top of its skull and twisted it. The remaining statues dropped where they stood and crumbled to the ground. The holy man used his claymore to cut the head loose from its chains and let it crash to the ground below with him on top of it. The little girl stepped down from her swing in tears and towards her brother's head that was split down the middle. "Just leave and make your bloody wish to rid the world of this tower." She fell to her knees and in front of her slain brother's head and sobbed as a wave pulsed from under her. Everything it touched changed the garden into what it truly was and ended at the ceiling above. The holy man looked down at the little girl that was a ghoulish woman whose skin fell from her face. He stepped down from upon her brother's slayed head and looked over his side to the soulless being beside him while it cried. He rested his claymore against his shoulder and closed his eyes, then opened them as he stood on top of the tower under a warm sun kissing his scarless skin. The holy man got to his knees, placed his claymore next to him and bowed his head, facing the east. The thorned rosary loosened up and fell from his right forearm to the ground next to him. The back of his iron mask cracked as he rose upright, looking up at the blue sky. The holy man placed his fingers into the crack of his unfastened iron mask and pried it off to reveal a young man beneath, with his blonde hair unravelled to the floor. The sun touched his face for the first time in centuries. With a smile that spread from ear to ear, his body rapidly aged and withered away until a gust of wind erased him from the world, leaving gifts for the next to successfully scale the tower. And that's it for tonight, my little hellhounds. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed tonight's scary story, then don't forget to like and subscribe and click the bell icon so you get notified every time I upload a new video. If you have any scary stories you want narrated on the channel, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Now, good night, my little hellhounds.